what if the experience is an illusion? Like, how do we know? What if the agency that we experience is an illusion?
An illusion looking from where? Like, right, because that already requires to take that stance is you've already pushed yourself into that third person view,
Okay.
right? And so what we're saying is that third person view, which now you're going to say like, oh, I've got a whole other set of entities, of ontological entities, meaning, things that I think exist in God's living room in spite, that are independent of me and the community of living things I'm part of.
So you're pushing it elsewhere. There's just like there's a stack of turtles. There's probably if this experience, the human experience, is an illusion, maybe there's an observer for whom it's not an illusion. So you always have to find an observer somewhere.
Yeah, right. And that's why fundamentally the blind spot, especially the scientific triumphalist part, is following a religious impulse. It's wanting the God's eye view. And what's really interesting, and when we think about this and the way this gets talked about, especially publicly, there's a line of philosophical inquiry that this language gets couched in. And it is actually it's only one version of philosophy, right? So it is pretty much what we call the analytic tradition, right? But there's even in Europe, or in the Western tradition, in the what we'll call Western philosophy, there's phenomenology. There's Husserl and Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, which took an entirely different track. They were really interested in the structure of experience. They spent all their time trying to understand, trying to develop a language that could kind of climb into the circle that is experience, right? Experience, you're not gonna be able to start with axioms and work your way to it. It's given, so you have to kind of jump in and then try and find a language to account for its structure. But then, so that has not been part of this discussion about, good luck finding a YouTube video where someone, a famous scientist is talking about science from a phenomenological point of view, even though it's a huge branch of philosophy. And then you get the philosophies that occurred from other cores of civilization, right? So there's the Western core, out of which comes the Greeks and the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. But then you get India and you get Asia, and they developed their own. They were highly complex societies that developed their own responses to these questions. And they, for reasons, because they had contemplative practice, they were very focused on trying to directly probe attention and experience. They asked questions in ways that the West never really did. Phenomenology kind of started it, but there's philosophers like Nagarjuna and Vasubandhu, and they're like the Plato and the Aristotle of sort of those philosophies, and they were really focused on experience. In the West, I think maybe because we had the Judeo-Christian tradition, where we already had this kind of God who was going to be the frame on which you could always point to that frame. The traditions that came from the classical philosophies of India and Asia, they started always with, they wanted to know about experience. Their whole philosophies and their logic and their argumentation was based on, I've got this experience. I can't get out of this experience. How do I reason from it? So I think there's a lot of other philosophical traditions that we could draw from, not slavishly. We don't all have to become Buddhists to do it, but there are traditions that really tried to work this out in a way that the Western traditions just didn't.
But there's also the practical fact that it's difficult to build a logical system on top of experience. It's difficult to have the rigor of science on top of experience. And so as science advances, we might get better and better. Like the same as it's very difficult to have any kind of mathematical or kind of scientific rigor to why complexity emerges from simple rules and simple objects, sort of the Santa Fe questions.
Yeah, I think we can do it. I think there's aspects of it. I mean, as long as you're never trying to this is what experience is. I think that's kind of where we're, you're never going to have a causal account of experience because it's just given. But you can do lots about, and that's what the good work is to, how do I approach this? How do I approach this in a way that's rigorous that I can do experiments with also? But so, for example, I was just reading this beautiful paper that was talking about this is what we're counting with our semantic information too, causal closure. Love this idea, right? The idea that, so we talked about autopoiesis a while back, right? The idea that living systems are, they are self-creating and self-maintaining. So the membrane, cell membrane is a great example of this, right? The cell membrane, you can't have a cell without a cell membrane. The cell membrane lets stuff through, keeps other stuff out, right? But the cell membrane is part of the processes it's a product of the processes that the cell membrane needs, right? In some sense, the cell membrane creates itself. So there's this strange, it's always with life, there's always this strange loop.
Mm-hmm.
And so somehow figuring out how to jump into that strange loop is, the science that's ahead of us. And so this idea of causal closure, accounting for how we talk about like downward causation, right? So reductionism says everything only depends on the microstate. Everything just depends on the atoms, right? That's it. You don't really, if you know the Lagrangian for the standard model, you're done. Of course, in principle, you need God's computer, but fine. In principle, it can be done. Causal closure, and I was just reading this great paper that sort of argues for this. There's ways in which, using epsilon machines and all this machinery from information theory, that you can see ways in which the system can organize itself so that it decouples from the microstates. Now, the macrostate fundamentally no longer needs the microstate for its own description, its own account of the laws. Whether that paper is true or not, it's an example of heading down that road. There's also Robert Rosen's work. He was a theoretical biologist who he talked about closure to efficient cause, that living systems, are organizationally closed, are causally closed, so that they don't depend anymore on the microstate. And he had a proof, which is very contentious. Nobody knows if it's, some argue it's true, some argue it's not. But he said that because of this, living systems are not Church-Turing complete. They cannot be represented as formal systems. So, in that way, they're not axioms. Living systems will not be axioms. They can only be partially captured by algorithms. Now, again, people fight back and forth about whether or not his proof was, is valid or not. But I'm saying, I'm giving you examples of like, when you see the blind spot, when you acknowledge the blind spot, it opens up a whole other class of kinds of scientific investigations. The book we thought was going to be really heretical, right? Obviously, most public-facing scientists are very sort of in that, especially scientific triumphalism. So we were just like waiting for the fight. And then the review from Science came out, and it was like totally pro. It was very positive. We're like, oh my God, Yeah. And then a review came out in Nature Physics, and it was totally positive. And then a review came out in the Wall Street Journal, because we kind of criticized, not capitalism, but we criticized sort of all industrial economies for that they were sort of had been touched by the blind spot. Mm-hmm. Socialism, communism, doesn't matter. These extractive, had sort of had that sort of view that the world is just reducible to, mm-hmm. Resources. The Wall Street Journal gave us a great review. So it feels like there's actually there is some, among working scientists in particular, there is some dissatisfaction with this triumphalist view and a recognition that we need to shift something in order to like jump past these hurdles that we've been arguing about forever. And we're not, we're sort of stuck in a vortex.
Well, it is. I mean, I think there's a hunger to acknowledge that there's an elephant in the room, like that we're just removing the aging. Like everyone is doing it, and it's like, there's the experience, and then there's the third person perspective on the world,
right?
And so science from applying scientific rigor from a first person perspective is very difficult. I mean, it's fascinating.
I think we can do it because it's also the thing, what's really interesting is I think it's not just first person, it's first and second, right? Because one idea is that the idea that, science gives us this objective third person view. That's one way of talking about objectivity. There's a whole other way, is that I do the experiment, you do the experiment, we talk to each other, we agree on methods, and we both get the same result. That is a very different way of thinking about objectivity. And it acknowledges that, when we talk about agents, agency and individuality are flexible, right? So there's a great paper, speaking of Santa Fe, by David Krakauer, where they looked at sort of information theoretic measures of individuality. And what you find is it's actually pretty fluid. Like, my liver cell is an individual, but really it's part of the liver. And my liver is, a separate system, but really it's part of me. But I'm an individual, yay. But actually I'm part of a society. Like, and I couldn't be me without the entire community of, say, language users, right? I wouldn't even be able to frame any questions. And my community of language users is part of ecosystems, mm-hmm. right? That are alive, that I am a part of a lineage of. This is like Sarah Walker stuff. And then those ecosystems are part of the biosphere, right? We're never separable, as opposed to this very atomizing, the triumphalist science view wants like Boltzmann brains. You're just a brain floating in the space,
Yeah, there's a fascinating degree to which agency is fluid. Like, you are an individual, but you and I talking is a kind of individual.
Yeah.
And then the person listening to this right now is also an individual.
Right.
I mean, that's a weird thing too.
That's a weird thing, right?
Because there's a broadcast nature too.
This is why information theoretic. So the idea that we're pursuing now, which I get really excited about, is this idea of information architecture, right? Or organization, informational organization. Because, right, physicalism is like everything's atoms. But, Kant is apparently the one who came up with the word organism, because he recognized that life has a weird organization that was specifically different from machines. And so this idea that how do we engage with the idea that organization, which is often can be cast in information theoretic terms or computational terms even, is sort of, it's not really quite physical, right? It's embodied in physical, in the physical. It has to instantiate in the physical, but it also has this other realm of design, and some, not design like intelligent design, but there's a, organization itself is a relationship of constraints and information flow. And I think, again, that's an entirely new, interesting way that we might get a very different kind of science that would flow out of that.